Hogsty presents It's Just Business with Steve Thomas and Rich Rogers. And now, here's your host, Chris Larry.
Hello and welcome to another episode of It's Just Business, part of the Hogsty Network. This is the show where we talk about the dollars and cents of the sports industrial complex. I am joined by my two co-hosts today, Rich and Steve. Steve, how you doing?
Oh, I'm just doing awesome. We have lots of great stuff to talk about today. Down here in Texas where, winter is happening this week. Hopefully it'll be over next week. We can get back to shorts weather. But other than that, we're recording on Sunday, so I'm also excited about another Redskin game.
I'm doing great, guys. Just recovering from a Christmas party last night, so I'm a little bit. I'm trying to come off of IR today to do the show, but I'm doing pretty good. I'm no Jordan Reed today. I'm Zach Brown, so I'm ready.
All right, well, Rich, if you're ready, why don't you take us off into our first topic and get us going?
So the Players Coalition spearheaded the face of the Players Coalition is Malcolm Jenkins and Michael Bennett. I'm sorry, Anquan Bolden. Excuse me.
Right.
So Malcolm Jenkins and Anquan Bolden are part of the Players Coalition, and just as a bit of a background, the big topic of the NFL this past season has been the player protests and the kneeling during the national anthem. And the NFL has come out and said that they will donate $100 million over a period of over the next 10 years to the Players Coalition to assist with issues in the African American community. And that includes donations to organizations like the United Negro College Fund and other organizations that affect the African American community. The premise is that this will end the player protests. Well, as we find out, and there's many organizations, there's some trouble, there's some fungus among us in the organization, the Players Coalition, in that Eric Reed and Michael Thomas do not like that Malcolm Jenkins and Anquan Bolden essentially took this deal, and they're being called sellouts. And that's interesting because, to me, I think the NFL has done what they could do in terms of giving money. The NFL I don't think has any reach to directly end any type of police brutality or any other issue within the African American community other than donate money. So I think it's a good step by the NFL, and naturally there's some infighting, but I think it's a good first step by the NFL.
Yeah, well, yes, I agree. It's a good first step by the NFL, and the NFL isn't a charitable organization. It's a for-profit. It's a series of for-profit businesses. I guess I don't really understand what those players that don't agree with this payment really want. What do you want the NFL to do but give money? They're not set up to be an advocacy group necessarily. But I have a couple points. Number one, real quick before the show started, I did a search for an entity registered as the Players Coalition in the state of New York, and there is no entity registered as the Players Coalition in New York, which tells me that this Players Coalition is probably not a real entity. It's just what this group of players is calling themselves, which is fine. But number two, I think also this bodes really badly for the players for the CBA negotiations. If they can't even accept $100 million gift from the NFL without fighting between themselves.
Yeah.
Chris, what do you think?
Well, legal entity or not, they're fairly effective at getting $100 million directed towards causes they care about. And as a nonprofit professional who has spent much of my career in some form of fundraising, I have to give massive props for that. That's a lot of money. So I don't know. This whole topic so wildly spiraled out of control on so many fronts that it got just into sort of bizarro land. So I don't see the limited effectiveness of any of the strategies on any of the sides is such diminishing returns that if I was the players or players who care about these topics, I would count this as a victory and realize that there was going to be no more honest public debate based on this version of the protest anyway, and $100 million, whether you think of it as a buy-off, an extortion deal, or good faith, is a lot of money that means a lot of difference in the organizations that it will go to. So in my mind, and maybe this is a little bit milquetoast on either side of the spectrum, I would cash the money and move on to different ways to tackle these issues.
Yeah, I think I can't remember if I've ever said it on this show, but I've said it on the Hogs side, and I've told you guys off air. I've represented a couple NFL teams, and I've worked closely with the NFL on a Super Bowl. So I actually know how the NFL operates. I don't profess to be an expert. I don't represent any NFL teams anymore. But, they're usually the 800-pound gorilla. They usually don't negotiate very well. They don't bargain very well. They usually come in and say, okay, we're the NFL and you're not. This is what we want. Deal with it, period, or get out. And so the idea that the NFL has voluntarily given $100 million, and by the way, it's not a $100 million payment, lump sum. It's supposed to be $100 million over a number of years through, I think, 2023. And so it's a few $million a year. It starts at $5 million and it goes up to $12 million over the years. And so it's, if you split that up between 32 owners, it's really not that much money from that perspective. But what's interesting is that they did this without any guarantee from the NFLPA or this Players Coalition that the kneeling protest is going to stop, which is very un-NFL-like to me. From my perspective, it's like they just all of a sudden forgot to negotiate. I don't know why they would do this without some kind of guarantee that the protests would stop, because the protests are in part the protests are one of the causes behind the decline in ratings and interest in the NFL this year. And so the whole point is to get that to stop. And why they did this without a guarantee that it would stop is kind of mind-boggling to me.
What's interesting is that the organizations, and I was kind of shocked that money would go to the United Negro College Fund, and I'm not suggesting that that's not a word. I mean, that's a
worthy cause.
Yeah, it is a worthy cause. And it goes back to, excuse me, exactly what are we protesting? Now, of course, the United Negro College Fund doles out money to historically black colleges and universities, mostly, if not all, that are private. But I'm also interested in how they would give money specifically to address the issue of excessive force in the African American community and people of color. But I was a little shocked at that but I do also think that, to your point, money helps, because these nonprofits, they need money to be able to service the community. So I do think it's a good first step, and those that disagree and look at them as sellouts, it's just dumb, in my opinion.
I think the United Negro College Fund, and there's another organization called the Dream Corps, which I personally have never heard of. I don't know, Chris, you know these organizations better. I don't know if you've heard of it, but I think the United Negro College Fund is something that that's not going to cause controversy, right? It gives scholarship money to people of need. And yeah, okay, it's limited to one ethnic group, but that's fine. Everybody needs to go to college. If you start giving money to causes that concern police brutality, that brings up a whole nother round of controversy, because there's a whole group of people out there who think that there is no police brutality problem in this country. And the last thing the NFL wants to do is cause more controversy. They want to limit the controversy. And so my guess is that we arrived at the United Negro College Fund and this Dream Corps as a controversy to find some causes that the NFL could do without creating more problems for itself.
Yeah.
But Chris, do you know anything about this Dream Corps?
I don't know much about Dream Corps, and I would definitely agree that this was a safe place to park this money. I think that was definitely why it went there. I also agree it only tangentially or very marginally addresses the problem. That was theoretically the start of the protest. The problem that this whole thing, I mean, I'm going to say my opinion, I think this is one of the most giant non-stories of all time, ultimately, where everyone is overreacting and being stupid. So there's my opinion. But someone
you're talking about, and interrupt, you're talking about the what do you think is stupid?
Everybody. I think everyone is
the whole thing,
every
entirety?
angle. This has gotten dumb.
Okay, fair enough. Go ahead.
I agree.
So, someone who has actually been involved in social movements and has studied them, this is not an effective social movement. It was something that happened from one player. There was no kind of central organization. It really wasn't very well thought through. There was no organization that came out behind this as a way to do the real political organizing. There was no planks or demands. I understand the big issues, don't get me wrong. I'm not debating that. So what I'm saying is it potentially did more harm than good in all different kinds of ways, even to these individual players' careers, obviously. I think it's time for everyone to take a step back and realize that none of this is actually changing the needle on any of these issues, and take a breath and look at other ways and count this money as $100 million more into places like the United Negro College Fund and this Dream Corps, which is, quite frankly, even, in some of these places, $5 million in 2018 is not trivial. So it just is not an effective way to have a natural discourse, to have a political agenda on these topics. Or you could make the case that it's already done some good, and that this kind of continued back and forth in this forum is a diminishing returns. And if I was a social activist consultant for the Players Coalition, I would be advising them to take a step back and look at different ways to organize more directly, using their celebrity and their money on the issues at hand through organizations that know how to battle these kind of societal problems. Enough already. No one is being helped by any of this at this point.
Well, yeah, I mean, eventually all this controversy is going to hurt in the form of money, because the less popular the NFL becomes, the lower the ratings go across all platforms, the less money they're eventually going to get in future media deals, and that's going to hurt both the players and the owners. The players more, because the owners could retire today and live in luxury and they'd be fine. That's not necessarily true for all the players. And by the way, I just wanted to bring this up. I don't know, 2 shows ago, at one point I said something to the effect of the players don't have the life skills to survive a strike, and it was brought up to me that that's a really poor choice of words. When you do hours and hours and hours of talking, on these live shows like this, sometimes you misspeak. What I really meant by the word life skills was job skills, and it just came out wrong. So if anybody caught that, sorry. But my point is that at some point this is going to be a diminishing return. But what's most interesting to me, and what I'd like to get you guys' opinion on, is the players can't even get organized enough to accept $100 million without publicly arguing with themselves. So I don't know what anybody expects is going to happen when the next CBA is negotiated in 2021.
Well, I've long argued, and I agree with Chris, that this was not thought out very well. We've talked about the issue of people boycotting the NFL, particularly in the African American community. There's a lot of chatting within my social circle about that, and I told them I will continue to watch football, and I will always watch football, because I just feel that you're not this boycotting. This is not going to have a direct effect on the use of excessive force by the police. Now, if you want to, because I just feel like you can't do anything like that unless you change there's some legal things and there's some constitutional things that people don't understand the intricacy of how much latitude that police officers have that's granted by the Constitution. But not to get all into that, because Steve, you're the legal eagle here. But I could
talk for hours on that if you want, but I don't think that's beyond the scope.
Yeah,
of the
but I just think that the fact that the NFL stepped up with money, money talks, and hopefully it's put to good use, and hopefully there's some safeguards against abuse and misuse of the money or misappropriation. But you're right, Chris. I think this was not planned out well. I think it's a spectacle, and to put it plainly, some people don't even know what it is that they're protesting.
Well, that's true. I mean, yes. Again, I think from a business perspective, it's a pretty minor thing to the NFL to give out this money. I'm surprised that they did it without any assurances, because if they give this money and the protests don't end, it doesn't solve their problem. And that's, if this continues another year, I mean, the owners would have only themselves to blame if they allow this to continue another year. And it's interesting, Richard, you said in your social circle people are, boycotting the NFL. Well, it's the same thing in mine. I'm politically conservative, and so people who I know who are also politically conservative are also boycotting the NFL, but for the opposite reason, because they hate the protest.
Right.
And so they have two different groups of people now who are have completely opposite views, both boycotting the NFL, which is what the NFL wants is for people to watch games and buy jerseys, and we've gone way far away from it. I mean, Chris, you're right. The whole thing has become just ridiculous at this point, and it needs to end.
Well, there you go. So let's transition to the next topic. Definitive statement. So we'll travel all the way across the world on both a geographical and conceptual front, and talk a little bit about big Olympic news. Olympic news is something that we've followed on this show since we launched, basically, because it really does talk about global sports business issues at a whole different level. Well, it was just announced last week that the IOC has banned the entire Russian Winter Olympic sports team from participating in the Winter Olympics coming up in South Korea. Not only, I found this kind of interesting, not only are they banning their athletes, they're sort of scrubbing Russia from the Olympics at all. Like, no flag, like, it's like the country doesn't exist for the 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks of this Winter Olympics. So I'd like to talk about this a little bit. This, we've seen obviously steroid scandals, performance-enhancing drug scandals rock sports on all fronts. But most of the time they're an individual story. Lance Armstrong, Roger Clemens, et cetera, et cetera. This, to have an entire country, an entire athletic coalition be banned for institutionalized cheating, I don't think we've ever seen that. And if we are actually, does this start to force the conversation about actually having a 21st century view of performance enhancing drugs in sports?
China came within a hair of getting banned itself a couple Summer Olympics ago, when they saw for various cheating scandals. I think we saw back in, maybe was it 2012 Olympics, when the Chinese women's Olympic team, a gymnast team, they showed pictures of girls with their baby teeth still, and it was very obvious that they were way younger than China said they were. Germany has gotten in trouble repeatedly for systematic doping. The United States track team has gotten in trouble, albeit not on a systematic way. They've gotten in trouble for a bunch of individual sprinters cheating. I wish that these American sports leagues would be as harsh as the Olympic Committee on drugs generally. The Olympic Committee doesn't mess around. They're going to take your medals. They're going to erase you from the record books. They're going to ban a country. That's how to deal with drugs, if you ask me. But I don't think we've ever seen it before, and the allegations are that it was a widespread systematic cheating scandal and cheating in your analysis testing, managed by the Russian government, and that's why they got banned. So, I'm an Olympic fan, And so it's sad to see those players, those Olympic athletes, not get their chance. But at the same time, you got to clean up the sport. Now, what's interesting is that the Olympic Committee is allowing certain athletes who are clean, who are from Russia, to compete under a neutral flag, which I don't remember seeing that before personally. That's interesting. So it's trying to throw the athletes a bone, to allow them to compete.
The closest analogy I can think to that neutral flag concept was when, right at the first two Olympics, I think, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they did the what do they call it, the coalition team, or they did some loose coalition of Soviet bloc countries were allowed to compete under one flag. But even that, they knew there was a shelf life on it, because it was just basically to get through one round of Olympics.
Right.
Well, it's interesting because I watched. They had a big in-depth story on this on the Today Show the other day, and I found it fascinating that the doctor that the whistleblower said he's afraid for his life now. Being in Russia, I'm sure. He said he's going to have to look over his shoulder for the rest of his life. But as they say, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. So I think that this is interesting in that I really don't know to do this and put the athletes in this particular position, and the outcome is not guaranteed. It's not like it's going to guarantee you, if you're doping, you're not guaranteed to win. So I just really don't get it, and I really don't understand it. Maybe it gives you a better chance, but I just don't see the reward with the risk. I don't know.
Well, I think I'm going to take a wild stab and say, when you are a Russian Olympic athlete, you might not have a choice but to take whatever performance-enhancing drugs they tell you to take. This is not... People need to remember out there that the Russian team, the Chinese team, they aren't run like the American Olympic team. These American athletes are kind of... There's a U.S. Olympic Committee, but it's not the U.S. government that's supporting them and training them. Whereas in Russia and China and some other totalitarian countries, the government is running this stuff. And by the way, the leader of Russia is a former KGB operative. And so it's not like a guy like that, and I'm talking about Vladimir Putin, so it's not like a guy like that has an issue with cheating, and it's not like he has an issue with forcing athletes to do stuff all for the glory of Mother Russia. So it doesn't surprise me that this scandal came out. The pro-U.S. nationalist in me says, screw him, and get rid of him. What I'm interested to see now is if, any of these Russian athletes are going to actually participate under a neutral flag, and if they do, what sort of logistics tail and support are they going to have? Are they totally on their own, or are elements of the Russian Olympic arm of the Russian government going to be there to support them? Or are they even allowed to do that?
I'm sure there's some money laundering scheme in some way that gets, the needed funds to them. It's really fascinating here because, and I know it's not necessarily for this show, but I have a political theory that we were too quick to claim victory on the Cold War, and we're seeing that now.
We need to start a political show between you and I. It'd be like The Odd Couple.
Yeah, probably. I'd be surprised that you would disagree that we actually aren't in the midst of Cold War Volume 2. But
I didn't say I did disagree, but go ahead.
So my only reason for bringing that up is that in the Cold War era, in the Soviet era, sports and the systemic, as Steve, you described, sports as propaganda, sports as national pride, sports as systemic government philosophy has not left. And so what this, or has been reborn. And this really is really is an extension of what the Soviet Empire did, in their kind of Olympic dominance during the Soviet regime. And of course, Putin is a veteran of that regime via the KGB. So this to me is an example. Now they got caught, I guess, or they did, but it's an example of the rebuilding of that Russian machine of sports and how much they view that as important to their global pursuits. So I think it's really fascinating just as an example at that level. Now, what I also think is interesting, kind of taking a step away from the geopolitical piece, is, at what point are we going to have a reckoning about what is actually performance-enhancing drugs? And because, we think steroids, maybe we think growth hormone, human growth hormone, but especially in Olympic contests, blood doping, oxygen swapping out there, it is so advanced, the kind of things that fall under here. And I wonder if we aren't needing to take a look at what is actually cheating and what is sports science. And I start to wonder, what is the difference between a 17-year-old opting for Tommy John surgery? What is the difference between LASIK surgery for improving eyesight and some of these different sports medicine techniques? I think what's cheating and not cheating doesn't necessarily make sense anymore. And I don't know. I think we're kind of in a 20th century view of sports medicine and cheating, and with 21st century science. And at some point, we have to have a reckoning about what is cheating and not cheating in sports science.
Well, first of all, Tommy John surgery is surgery to correct an injury. And so that's wholly different than somebody taking, say, HGH, which is a chemical to increase a body's ability to work out, grow when somebody works out. So that's totally different.
No, it's obviously different from a medical procedure standpoint, but there are kids that opt to have the Tommy John surgery without the injury.
Well, it's because they've been told that their tendon is about to rupture. Sorry.
Yeah, but you can say, sure,
no,
you can get doctors to sign it.
It's a preventive thing in Tommy John.
Yeah, sure. But you doesn't mean you can't get doctors to say, yes, he needs that preventively.
Okay, tell you what, let's forget about the Tommy John example here for a minute, because what your point is, I think what I'm hearing you say is, should we just allow athletes to take drugs, chemicals that increase performance, because what's the difference between blood oxygenation, say, and HGH? I would submit to you that the entire reason for disallowing performance-enhancing drugs is that we have to have athletic competition at the highest level that appears to be clean, so as to set the proper example for our youth, and to not encourage the young athletes out there, young amateur athletes, that this is okay. I think from my perspective, you want to see are athletes who are performing to the best of their natural ability, and I don't want to be in a position to encourage young athletes and young people to take drugs to increase their performance. And to me, that's the reason why the Olympics, the NFL, etc., are doing it, is to set the proper example.
Yeah, but I'd see you're actually falling prey to my argument in that you're not actually parsing out what is drugs, what is preventive medicine.
No, I'm not falling prey to your argument. I mean,
I'm saying, and I agree.
HGH and steroids are drugs, and you're injecting an artificial chemical or a natural chemical that's not produced by your body into your body for the purpose of increasing athletic performance, whereas Tommy John surgery is not that. Whereas blood oxygenation, it's not that. I think when you're injecting steroids into your butt, that's not the proper example to set.
Yeah, but this isn't the 70s. What's going on is what the IOC and other, which was probably the most aggressive, I agree.
Oh, absolutely.
What they're defining, it's not limited. It's not Lyle Alzado 70s steroids, right? So I think no one's looking at that totality of that list and actually having a critical analysis of what is cheating or what is drugs or what is medical science. I actually probably agree with you on your big points. I just think we haven't actually caught up with actually looking at this list and actually making critical analysis of what is actually cheating through drugs and what is medical science. sports medical science.
I mean, we'd have to probably save that for another show because I have not looked at that list in particular, and I'm not prepared to.
No, I'm just saying that but
go ahead.
Sports in general hasn't gone through, like, yeah, we haven't, of course, but they haven't as well. Like, that kind of analysis hasn't been done.
I don't know. I mean, I tend to be a lot harsher on stuff like that. Dan, it sounds like you probably are. Maybe not. I just can't excuse that. I think that you need to take I think these leagues need to take a dramatically harsher stance on it, not an easier stance. Rich, what do you think? We've kept you from expressing your views.
No, I find the conversation about what is performance-enhancing drugs and what aren't is to be fascinating. I was just sitting here thinking, what is a cortisone shot? I mean, is that performance-enhancing? Because if you take a cortisone shot, then doesn't that allow you to perform a little bit better than you normally would because you're injured? So, I think that topic is actually pretty fascinating. But I think as long as I guess I'm a little winning an Olympic gold medal certainly could open opportunities, business opportunities, but I'm just not sure on how much winning an Olympic gold medal is worth the risk of, with getting caught and banned and basically your reputation sullied. I mean, particularly look at Lance Armstrong. I mean, his name is mud at this point because he lied for so many years. But I just wonder if it's really all worth it in the end.
Well, Rich, you're an educator. I mean, you said on the show that you're an educator. Let me ask you this. You work with kids every day. Do you think that professional and Olympic athletes being caught taking steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs has an effect on how young people view their athletic development and athletic competitions?
Yes. I mean, I think that any player is looking for an edge because I guess, and maybe I'm answering my own question, winning opens opportunities. Winning, creates opportunities for that they may not have. And there's some people just, they're just hyper competitive that they're looking for any sort of advantage. But yeah, I do think that kids look at performance enhancing drugs and say, hey, I'm young. I'm not worried about any sort of what happens with my kidneys or, what happens with anything. I just know I got to be ready for the game and I got to win.
Well, like, for example, Trent Murphy with the Redskins. We're all Redskins fans here. Trent Murphy got banned for the use of performance-enhancing drugs. Is there a kid out there that's saying, well, Trent Murphy did it, so it must be okay?
I'm sure there is a kid out there that thinks that. But, and I just think that, again, the hyper-competitiveness. I mean, the other thing is, look, you've got somebody behind you ready to take your spot. Having been somewhat of an athlete back in my heyday, I mean, I didn't even play anything at any sort of professional level, but I wanted to play, and I played left field, and there was a guy that was on the bench that was waiting for me to drop a ball or waiting for me to strike out. So maybe I would have done it. So I don't know.
I mean, and to steer this back to the Olympics, I think I get your point, Chris. I mean, what's performance-enhancing drugs and what's not? And, for example, in baseball, all the old-timer baseball guys are all up in arms over the steroid era. Barry Bonds types in the Hall of Fame. And that's a whole other topic we got to address on the show, by the way. But, people forget that the old-time baseball players were all taking what's the drug? Help me.
Amphetamines.
Thank you. They were all taking amphetamines, And that's been common public knowledge. And to your point, Chris, an amphetamine, you could argue that amphetamine is a performance enhancing drug because I've never taken it, but presumably that gives you more energy, and and that's why they're doing it. So why isn't that a performance enhancing drug, and why aren't they all up in arms about that? But to the Olympics, I think if you have a country that is blatantly and obviously corrupt in terms of its ability to follow the rules, you have to get rid of them. And that's where you are with Russia. I mean, if people don't understand this, the drug program is administered through an organization called the World Anti-Doping Authority. And I think the last A is authority, WADA. And this WADA organization is just brutal, way harsher than the NFL drug guys are. And their penalties are harsher. They're more brutal about when they can test and all of this. And if somebody's just flaunting those rules, you got to get rid of them. And that's where Russia found themselves.
And please, listeners, Steve, Rich, don't get me wrong. I am for this ban. That's not my point. I think a couple things. Steve, you said it earlier. This is not a marginal downhill skier in Colorado gutting themselves to the Olympic trials, right? This is systemic.
Right.
This is like a scene from One Flew Over This Cuckoo's Nest, where you have people lined up to take their little plastic cup of pills, right? This is like there isn't necessarily a lot of choice involved in what performance enhancing procedures the government sports agency is going to administer to you. And yes, winning something like the Nordic Combined for Russia can mean that you and your family are set, for the foreseeable future. So there are in these international places fiscal and life gains for being, for competing and winning at that level that are much different than the United States or other parts of the West. So I please don't let anyone know that I actually think this ban's a good idea. I think it was probably a Olympic cycle too late. They came close to this at the Summer Olympics. It was talked about and sort of walked back beforehand. So I just think it's interesting that we haven't caught up and actually have that conversation about all the kind of huge laundry list of things now that are considered this way. But I am for this ban, and the systemic cheating here is staggering.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point. Your point is, let's kind of look at, from a big picture standpoint, what's cheating and not. But the point is they violate the rules. But I think it's time you want to move on?
Sure.
Chris, we've rattled on long enough.
That sounds good. All right, Steve, we're going to have you lead us on. This is a topic, NCAA sports in general, but also this recent Louisville college basketball Adidas scandal. It's one we've looked at in the past, and I assume we will continue to look at as new angles on the story erupt and the college basketball season heats up post-holiday. So, Steve, why don't you give us this little flare-up in the story that's come to light in the last few days?
Okay. As we last left it, Rick Pitino had been fired. A bunch of Adidas executives had been charged by the federal government for a variety of fraud and money laundering relating charges that all related to the Louisville basketball program and a couple other schools, and the systemic funneling of money to prospects. And so what caught my eye with this story here recently is that it is the December 10th version of ESPN has a story called "How a Mid-Level School Became the University of Adidas at Louisville." And this is in the ESPN Magazine's December 25th issue. So that's where you can find this, or it's online. And this tells the story of the Adidas Louisville scandal from the perspective of the Louisville athletic director. Now, if you stop to think about it, we have the University of Louisville, which is a ho-hum average state university that has historically played second fiddle to the University of Kentucky in athletically and academically and everything else, and all of a sudden it became a massive power. Well, how did that happen? Is Rick Pitino just some kind of genius basketball coach? Why are these five-star recruits all of a sudden wanting to come to the University of Louisville? Well, it's because they were getting paid. And now this particular story has to do with a guy named Tom Jurich, who was the AD at Louisville, and he went out and he got hundreds of millions of dollars in money from donors to do all sorts of things, build facilities, build new arenas, dramatically increase the budget of the University of Louisville athletic department by like 100-fold, or maybe 50-fold from what it was. He didn't get charged with a crime here. He negotiated a very, very, very biased lease for a new Louisville basketball team arena, in which the athletic department's getting like 90% of the revenue, and the state's getting less than 10% in some cases, and that the state's paying for, 75% of it, that kind of thing. And so his perspective of it is, I didn't violate a law. I just went out and convinced people to give us a lot of money, and what's wrong with that? It's an interesting perspective on it, but everybody needs to remember here that this is corruption in basketball at the highest level. It's money being used being paid by corporate America and by rich people to blatantly and obviously cheat. And this Tom Jurek guy was the ringleader.
Well,
thoughts?
I think that when I went on my little recruit visit for my college, I sure wished I had some sex going on at I think
nobody bought you strippers, Rich? Is that what you're saying?
Man, nobody bought me any strippers, and I'm disappointed. So, as far as I'm concerned, that ain't cheating, man. That's just that's a recruitment. That's a recruitment tool. So, but no, the hypocrisy of this whole thing. Louisville got caught, but I can't say everyone does it. But don't you think something?
Does anybody think that Louisville is the only one?
No, does that happen? And I don't want to single out any particular schools. I don't know if any listener, but to me, it's some of maybe the big SEC schools, or maybe some of the big conferences, Big 10, Big 12. This stuff probably goes on all the time. They just haven't been caught.
Rich, are you willing to talk about your recruiting visit? I know you haven't talked about the school you went to, but were you a baseball player?
No, I wasn't. But actually, there was no formalized sex for, I'll give you some strippers if you come to my school. But there was some informal activities related to that going on. But I can't. I'm not at liberty to say.
No, by the way, people, what he's talking about here is that before this FBI investigation came about, Rick Pitino had gotten in trouble for University of Louisville buying strippers for recruits, and he got suspended for a number of games for that, and that's what the reference is here.
Yes.
That Rich is talking about. Again, number one, I hope nobody out there thinks that this is it. Louisville might have been the most egregious example, but I find it very difficult to believe that other schools aren't doing the exact same thing, and that Adidas hasn't been funneling money to other recruits. But from the athletic department, from the focus today is really, was it okay for this athletic director, Tom Jurek, to, if that's how you pronounce his name, to do this much fundraising on the backs of the donors and on the backs of the city of Louisville and the state of Kentucky just to help a basketball program? Is there something fundamentally wrong with that when you have, the English department is struggling to meet its budgetary requirements?
Yeah, that's an interesting angle for me as well. And it's obvious that this was not, a lot of times when these big programs defend the investment in basketball and football, or in some case, smaller schools, a sport that is equally as powerful, not many, It is because it helps the whole university. And I think one of the things that points out in this article that it really doesn't, right? I mean, that money and that fundraising is pretty well firewalled off into the continued growth of these individual programs in an ecosystem of lots of programs, most of them education and focused and, well, you know, and supposed to be. The kind of pull quote that really jumped out at me, and it's not just this Tom Jurich, right? Really, he had a partner in crime in the university president, James Ramsey. But, you know, the
he was also fired.
Yeah. So Jim Wayne, who's a local state rep, maybe he's a U.S. actually. State rep Jim Wayne says, I think a great quote, and it's so powerful, I think I'm going to read it. I don't think Tom Jurich gets this, and I don't think Jim Ramsey got it, says State Rep Jim Wayne, whose district includes Louisville. The University of Louisville is a state facility, and it's not their kingdom. They are not kings and princes and the nobility in the kingdom. They are temporary stewards of these programs, and instead of seeing this as something that they should be responsible for and hold at high ethical standards as they execute their jobs, they're just doing the opposite. And so probably lots of it was in the realm of legal. But the problem is, what I think this representative Jim Wayne identifies is that these people use this for their own personal gain or for a very limited gain of something that they're trying to advance, not actually taking it in as their responsibility, especially in these state facilities, to run an institution. And that when that's so wildly out of whack, it allows these kinds of things to happen. And I thought that Wayne's comment here really kind of contextualized it for me, whether some of it is legal or not legal.
Yeah, and let it be said that this Tom Jurich fella, it was making millions of dollars a year, you know, and he was raising many, many more millions. I think that big-time athletics, and the NCAA is at fault. To me, if I were the emperor of the country, one of the things I would do is just get rid of the NCAA totally and start over, because I think it's become hopelessly ineffective at this point. But that's another subject for another day. I really think that big-time Division I athletics, particularly football and basketball, and is bleeding over into baseball now a little bit, but particularly football and basketball, it's become such a money-making operation. It's really gotten away from the idea that this was originally about education and character development. You know, you're supposed to bring young people in who play sports in college, and they are given scholarships as a means to allow them to come to attend college and as a means to develop them as men and women. And what it's really become about is just money, period. And I think, and it's just not limited to Louisville, when you have teams that the only way they can compete is to bring players in who are most clearly not college-worthy people from an educational standpoint. And I'm not talking about giving a disadvantaged youth who had a hard upbringing a chance. I'm talking about people who are criminals in some cases, who just flat out aren't smart enough to be college students in any way, and you're going to give them tons of money. Or, you know, you're going to give the university tons of money just to bring them in, just to win. It gets away from the original intent of college athletics, and maybe I'm a cynic, but I'm getting a little, it ruins the amateur nature of the competitive, it ruins the amateur nature of the sports for me a little bit.
Well, but on the other hand, and I understand, I agree with you, but how do universities improve their infrastructure? Where do they get the money to improve their infrastructure? I mean, you know, alumni donors and you know, state funding doesn't pay for state-of-the-art technology centers. You know, bowl game payments and things like that, TV deals coming from the conference help pay for that. So yeah, while I do understand that aspect of it, they generate revenue to improve their improve the infrastructure of their university.
I mean, I get that, but my point here is that if you have athletes, and Louisville's more guilty than most, you know, look, I mean, Louisville was a one-and-done school in basketball. You know, and if you have these kids here coming in and aren't students at all, basically, in the case of basketball, they really do one semester they do barely enough in one semester to stay eligible. If it's not about education at some level and people are getting degrees at some level in which they didn't earn, why are we doing it? This is supposed to be about education fundamentally, not money. And a big part of it offends me from that perspective.
So, Steve, I would argue that you're an idealist, not a cynic on this.
Maybe so.
The cynical approach is which is I would take is, at some point, which I don't think we're that far off on, is let's just call it what it is. Like, figure out some way to legislate big time college football and basketball in a way. I don't know, treat them like adjunct professors or some way. Because Rich is right. You're not going to just do away with this level of athletics in this country. There's too much money. There's too much tradition. There's too much value and enjoyment. It's high-quality sport, all that good stuff. So at some point, are we going to actually look at what is ways to make this more above board and not force the entire system into cheating in some capacity? I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know how that is, what that is, but I would love to at least have that as a way to start to tackle this problem.
I think the way to do it is to get rid of the NCAA, honestly.
Yeah,
it's
you
become
probably could be
so
right.
corrupt. I mean, it should be, though. You're right, Rich. It's not going to happen because too many people are making too much money. Yeah. But that's what needs to happen to accomplish the goal that Chris suggests, because it's become too cumbersome. Look, for example, the FBI, we started this conversation with the Louisville story. The FBI conducted an investigation over a number of years into this Adidas Louisville story that the NCAA knew absolutely not one thing about whatsoever. And the NCAA completely turned a blind eye towards what's going on at the University of Louisville, and they've basically shown that they're totally incapable of doing an investigation like this. They want to turn a blind eye to it. They don't want this to come out. Which is why the federal government has to step in. And so I think the only way to ultimately solve the problem would be to get rid of the NCAA, which, as you point out, Rich, is never going to happen.
Yeah, but I don't think you do away with it. And probably in lots of ways in which we don't see or discuss, it would be harmful to do away with the NCAA, right? I think it's some way
a different organization is what I mean.
Yeah, or firewall out this part of it from the other things. Because I agree with you, Steve, is it also has a negative effect on college there are copycats within the NCAA, right? So there might, at the level of football or basketball, but if you look at women's basketball programs in certain parts of the country, you look at women's volleyball, you look at lacrosse in the Mid-Atlantic, there are other sports that may be a little bit more niche, they may be more regional, but they are still powerful, they're still expensive, they still raise money, and those sports and in those places, they're aping these. They're actually following these models. So it actually, to compete, they're actually taking these tactics, not going a different route. So I'd say, even to your point, in terms of banning the NCAA, is we focus on basketball and football, as we should, but lots of other sports are starting to basically take the same techniques.
Absolutely.
Yeah, women's basketball would be the one I'm thinking of, and because baseball is starting to get to that, but they're not really there yet. So it's really, to me, it's women's basketball. It's sort of taking the next step.
Yeah, and they're all copycats. That's the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're obviously not going to solve 100 years of corruption in college athletics in the next 3 minutes. And this is definitely a story that there's many angles. This one's fascinating in terms of the sort of regional power that this gives some individuals, which I think I would definitely go ahead and give this a read. This is a shade on one aspect of the story, but there will be many others as the months tick forward, I would suspect.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. It's something we'll be looking at for probably years to come on this show.
Definitely. All right, so with that gets us out of here for this 2 weeks episode. As always, please reach out if you've got story ideas, commentary, call us idiots, buy us lunch, whatever you want. Please reach out to us via officially the Hog Sty Twitter handle. I can be reached at ChrisLarry33. Rich, where can they yell at you?
Disco Q, DISCOQUE5 on Twitter. Hit me up.
I'm at the Hog Sty. Please don't try to track me down individually. I'd appreciate it.
And we've had some people start to kind of pick up on some things we've thrown down. So we'd love to get more engagement. So that is where you can find us, even if you want to express your rage. We will take it.
Yep.
All right.
All right. See you next time.
All right. See you guys.